So hi, Andy.
Hi,
Thanks
Angela. How are
for
you?
uh, thanks for hanging out with me, and I'm glad we had a few minutes to catch up before I started recording. Can you tell everybody a little bit about who you are and what you teach, and especially what you write, um,
Yeah,
and where you're coming from?
Yeah, my name is Andy Schoenborn. I teach in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, which is kind of right in the middle of the state. We are right across the street from Central Michigan University. I've been teaching for, I'm not usually one of those teachers that think about how many years I've been teaching, but I think it's been about 19 years now that I've been in the classroom. And I've had a pretty vast and varied experience. I kind of started up the ranks with our local Michigan Council of Teachers of English literacy affiliate and eventually became president there and now I'm past president. Got involved with the Chippewa River Writing Project through the National Writing Project with Troy Hicks at Central. Have been doing that for about 10 years and have
What a
done
great opportunity that
consultant
is.
work with them. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Um, and right now I'm with the Michigan Reading Association and also with Jennifer Lafine's group, Teach Right. So a lot of writing, a lot of process thinking, a lot of design theory, and also living in Mount Pleasant, some rural perspectives that I'd like to bring in to my classrooms as well, because we talk an awful lot about reaching our students where they're at and meeting their needs. And a rural perspective, students have different kinds of needs that they want to look at, and sometimes school can just feel like school, like you're going down a conveyor belt, um, but it doesn't have to be that way. And not to differentiate rural needs from urban needs, but um, I don't know, there's something to be said that we might have a curriculum that we teach, but who are we responsive to? Are we responsive and responsible for the curriculum? Or are we responsive and responsible for the students who are walking into our classrooms, either virtually or physically? And if you were to ask me, I lean to be responsive towards my students.
So, what are some of the things that you do to see your students and to understand the place that they're coming from?
Well, we start with writing, and we start with a lot of personal writing. Very first day of school, and this happened both in it. I should say too that I'm teaching in a high flex and a hybrid and a virtual classroom right now. So I'm running the gamut of all of it. And
Throughout a single school day, you have all three of those experiences going on.
yeah, yep. And inviting pre-service students in too. So a lot of different kinds of teaching and thinking. But I've noticed that we can, if we focus on process, we can bring our different processes together, and we create different habits and routines, and that will help us all, and myself included when I say us, not just students, because I'm a teacher writer who writes along with my students and thinks along with my students and shares work. So I think that we can bring that together and in pretty meaningful ways. So on the very first day of school, I asked students to grab something to write with and something to write on. And I don't mind if that's a pad of paper. I don't mind if it's a journal. I don't mind if it's a phone, whatever they're comfortable with. And we traveled out to the football field where
I
I
saw the
asked,
pictures.
yeah, where I asked them to think about their seniors that I teach. So think about what has brought them to the point they are in their life, and ask them to think about their literacy lives and their literacy journeys. And, one of my primary focuses is on a reflection. I don't think we do that enough in school. Just school can be this thing that you just sort of grind your way through, you know, and life can be a thing that you grind your way through. But if we pause every once in a while and reflect on those moments that we begin to notice that is shaping us or maybe causing us to think differently, I think we start to learn in a more of a mosaic of thought, than anything else. And it's a pretty interesting perspective. So I first get to know students by that. We can talk about social emotional learning. And I think we can do a lot of that in our writing. I encourage students to be vulnerable in their writing. Caution them not to be confessional, because I'm not asking you to be confessional, but it is helpful to be vulnerable, because you probably know, and all of us have a sense that the writing that we like to read gives us a little bit of inside information, right?
That's a really good way of putting it.
Yeah, they give us little windows into someone else's perspective.
And
And
in that way, it develops, you almost develop a relationship with the author as you're reading. And you're striving to build a relationship with those who are reading your words too. I'm really intrigued by the way you distinguish being confessional from being vulnerable. How do you define that for your students so that they understand the difference?
well, I'll share a vulnerable experience with you right now. So sometimes when I'm pausing as I talk, it's because I'm trying to get a hold of what I want to say. I have a tendency, and it makes me I feel vulnerable right now. So I have a tendency sometimes to mumble or stutter, especially when I get very excited about something. And talking about learning and teaching and being here with you and everyone else, I can get excitable with that. And so being able to recognize, to say to someone that, mumbling is something that I do, I think that's kind of a vulnerable moment where I feel like, um, I feel like maybe I shouldn't be talking about it, but it's not that big of a deal if I do talk
Right,
about it. It's just a piece of who I am.
right.
Whereas confessional might get down into the nitty gritty of where did that really come from? Like the real, maybe um, the subconscious maybe reasons for why that kind of happened. So when I ask students to write, and I ask them to write in a vulnerable way, I want them to be able to feel comfortable enough to share some of the details of their lives and their particular perspectives without having, kind of, this will sound sort of weird, but kind of scratch at the surface a little bit of maybe a wound that they have without actually pulling the scab back on that wound and really digging into the cause of it.
Yeah, you have me thinking a lot. I find this very interesting right now, so I'm sorry if we're kind of bird walking a bit
Okay.
off of the main topic. It's sort of like the difference between revealing a bit of something about yourself that might be uncomfortable because it builds relationships with your reader and they might be able to relate to. Maybe they don't have a similar sort of hang up, but maybe they can completely relate to how you feel about it. Where
That's
when we are confessional, we're sharing details that other people may not be able to relate to as at all, but those details might actually be triggering or leave people feeling like they should be helping us or serving us in some way and making it better. And that's not a great way necessarily to build relationships with a reader unless they signed up for that.
Yes, right. And I think not just the reader signing up for it, but the writer is signing up for it as well, right?
Yeah, yeah. So do
There's
you find that your students struggle to be vulnerable as writers? Does that shift over the course of your time together?
I think it shifts, and I think we spend a little bit of time every single day. We read poetry every day in my classroom, every single day, and we don't beat it up. We just honor the words, and we're grateful that the words are there. So yes, on Mondays, we usually watch some kind of a spoken word poet so we can sort of see an expert do it. So
Yeah.
actually, yesterday, we listened to Elizabeth Acevedo's poem Hair, which is a beautiful piece and a powerful piece. Um, and then today, we're kind of working our way through Date and Time by Phil Kay, which is fantastic. And, I think, do you mind if I read a poem real quick?
Please do.
So this is what
Please
I'm
do.
reading in class today. It's called Roller Coaster. And it's about relationships, but it's about relationships in lots of different kinds of ways. But I think what you'll hear in this is you'll hear some of those sort of nuanced vulnerabilities that exist in the words of this case, in the speaker, in the poem. And the reason why I want to share this is because it's hard to be vulnerable by just me sharing all the time or having someone else share all the time. But when we bring in another person's words, those other words that we bring in, that person is the one who's kind of enough removed from us. And well, it's written in a book. So
Oh, that's interesting.
we have permission then to
Yeah.
hear it. Okay. This is called Roller Coaster. Michael tells me dating is like a roller coaster. Fun, but a lot of ups and downs. Well, at dinner, the glowing thing in my pocket coyly whirls against my thigh, and a person I have met once, now thousands of miles away, has sent me parts of her body we used to whisper about at sleepovers. Dan tells me about his wife, uses words like happiness without caveat or attached guru, but still cannot help asking about what it must be like to discover a whole body, to gently approach the shore of a willing continent that does not ask to build shelter. I wake up next to a body. We chant words that sound mostly like, I'm not lonely now. Now clothed, she says plainly, I have some other errands to run. And I think on the small cruelty of the word other. My family and I visit Disneyland, and I ride a coaster I was too young for as a child. I think less about the brightly colored cars charging up toward the sky and racing down toward the ground, and more about the audible thrill as we come quickly around some corner we cannot see past. But even more, I think of the muted shuffling as we exit, remembering to not leave anything important behind. The quiet as we turn our back, wondering where to go next. My sister says, I think I'm ready to go home. And I nod. So what I love about that piece is woven all through the language that Phil Kay has brought in are different moments of vulnerability that we have perhaps connections to. We may not have the same connections to the vulnerabilities that that speaker has, but we begin to learn that it's okay to use powerful words. Because when we recognize, when I say we, I'm meaning a reader or an experiencer of some work, when this person recognizes that those are the types of words and those are the types of emotions and those are the types of feelings that bring people in, as far as an audience like yourself or the people who are viewing this, then we can really understand the power of words without having to say, you know, Angela, words are really powerful. Or, you know, Angela, you can probably empathize or sympathize with this. I don't feel as though I need to give a mini lesson on that because it's something that we're sort of surrounded with, right? We pause and just think about those words.
So, what do you wish other people knew and understood and appreciated about the vulnerabilities of young rural writers?
Well, first of all, for all rural writers and people in general, one of the things I wish people knew was that you already have the words in you, Angela. I already have the words in me. Our students already have the words in them, rural or otherwise. They're already there. We just have to create, as teachers, we have to create the conditions to allow those words to reveal themselves. Okay? So from a rural perspective, I think about how can we honor the places we call home? Where are the stories that are in our surroundings? Because a lot of times, if you look at the news or you listen to podcasts or if you read the books that we have on our shelves, they always seem to be somewhere else.
That's
Somewhere
interesting.
else. That's way more important, perhaps, or at least feels that way, or is something that, you know, is beyond where we're at that well, and to use the words from Phil Kay's piece, Roller Coaster, that makes you as a rural person can feel other. You feel like maybe, I don't know, your small town somewhere is just as insignificant as it feels. And yet it's not. There are
Right.
stories there. And
Right.
there have been stories for generations that are there. And they're not always about farming. Because we all have our own things that we bring to the table. I was a kid that when I grew up in rural communities, I never really felt like I belonged in a rural community because I wasn't the farmer kind of kid. That wasn't me. But you know, as I grew older, I realized there was a space for me and there was a place for me. And it may feel and look a little different than the stereotypes that are out there, or even the prevalent viewpoints that are in rural communities. Even in urban communities, there's prevalent viewpoints, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting to me about how we can help students think about those places where they come from first. And I think the reason that I like to focus on that is because I guess I'm curious about your perspective too, Angela, and everyone else's. But when I think about being a writer, we can talk about having a purpose and we can talk about having an audience, right? And usually, at least in my experience, usually the purpose is for something else and the audience is for someone else. But I
Hmm.
think we're missing a small portion with that because in my experience as a writer, the purpose first has to be a purpose that I want to have, has to be my purpose, my goal. And then for an audience, I am my first audience, right? I need, as far as I'm concerned, I need to write to please me first, not in a perfectionist kind of a way, but
Right.
I want to be able to write the books that I would want to read. I would
Yeah.
want to be able to share the narratives that I feel are important first. And I think that it isn't so far removed from the idea of when you write what you want to write and you share what you want to share, you don't have to worry about the audience somewhere out there, because when you start to make public and visible your writing, your audience begins to come to you because there's other people who can empathize and sympathize and
Right.
understand your perspectives, who also feel as though their voices haven't been heard.
Right.
And you give sound to that voice.
What you're making me think about is the potential for a rural writer inside of all of us.
We
Because
have.
I've never thought about this before until you started speaking about it today. But I grew up in a place that was very rural when I was little, but it
Mhm.
evolved over time. It's a second ring suburban area. And so there's been a lot of movement and a lot of development in this once rural town. And now it's definitely more suburban than I would characterize it as rural. But what I know is that in order for me to really write in a satisfying way, I need that quiet that I had when I was little, because I became a writer because I didn't have anything else to do. My
Mhm.
mom would take me to the library every weekend, but I would tear through those books really quickly. So I started writing stories because I ran out of stories to read. So I would
Mhm.
write them and read them back to myself. And so this whole notion of, I'm my own audience first, I think is huge. But I also think, sometimes people will remark on the fact that even in the field, I kind of hang on the fringes of certain conversations and I
Mhm.
hang on the fringes of certain groups. And I've never been one to pound down doors and like push my way into any circle. And I think it's because that's where I'm comfortable, is in that place where maybe I am more alone and a little bit more rural
Mhm.
um, than other people might be. It's interesting that you say that, and I love how writing from this sense of place isn't something that I've reflected on in the
Mhm.
past, and that's a deeply satisfying thing to think about. Writing from your home and figuring out what is significant about that, and how even if it is dramatically different from where other people physically exist, there's still so much that we can connect around when we find those stories and when we share them. That's
Mhm.
fascinating to me. Something else that you have me thinking about, in pre-COVID days, my day-to-day professional existence was so richly rewarding and relatively uncomplicated that reflection felt like something that I had to force myself to stop and do in order to continue learning and growing. And now, while my day-to-day is still, it's still work that is satisfying. It's still work that I think is useful to people. Like many people, though, I'm feeling like I've lost the dimension of my days to some degree. because most of my work is happening remotely right now. And what I'm finding is that my relationship with reflection has changed dramatically too. And that um, reflection is actually something that isn't something, it isn't something that I'm stopping and feeling like I have to stop and do like a duty. Reflection is something that is actually more satisfying, and it's helping me notice what matters inside of an experience that feels incredibly challenging and sometimes really exhausting. And so my relationship, I think, with reflection has shifted dramatically as a result of COVID life and COVID work, which is
I'm
interesting.
glad you said all of that, and I was shuffling around a bit because I'm hoping I can share my screen. I'm not sure if I can or not, but, part of that reflection, and just with any work that we do, and when your work with Make Writing too, this is something that becomes important. I work from a writing workshop perspective, um, but I also keep in mind too, I try to reflect on what works for me as a writer. Not that that's going to work for everybody, but I do know this, like I need time and space. I need time and space. So like in my classroom, I try to offer that time and space. And when I mean space, I mean just a quick, Angela, do you understand what I'm asking you to do right now? And either you do or you don't. And then if you don't, I can work with you. But if you do, then I back off. I
Get out of
back
the
off.
way.
I let you do what you need to do, and then I'll help you if something arises, right? And from a COVID perspective, I noticed that I needed to back off a little bit too. And so I decided that I was going to journal some things. I didn't do any COVID journaling because I was thinking about some other work that I was working on, but I did want to play and I wanted to experiment with something. So I'm going to try to share this.
Yeah, you can. I made you co-host.
Okay, awesome. Thanks.
Oh, look at that.
So this is my journal that I've been writing on, and a lot of it's a lot of different things, but this happens to be what I've been doing for a professional book that I'm working in right now. And if you haven't read Patrice Vachon, I think is how you say her name, My Shattering Whispering Voice. This is just a fantastic book that helps me not only to think about poems, but also helps me to think about um, writing in general. And I love when she says, here's the deal. It's ultimately about what you believe. So when it comes down to what you're going to be writing, any type of thing that you're writing, you have to bring that kind of a thing to you, that imagination, that possibility, that worthiness of your individual conviction. So when I work with my students as well, I often ask them, what is your intellectual investment in this piece that you're working on? If they tell me, well, I want to get an A, that is not an intellectual investment, right? So how are you connecting with whatever work that you're working on? And if you're finding that you're not, that's something to consider as well, right? How can you find something that you are connecting with? Because when we do that, we can build together these ideas. And I love how Patrice Vachon says this too. She's talking about poetry, but I think that we can talk about it in lots of different ways. Poems may be built from fragments, assorted threads that through writing are woven into new cloth. So when I think about that with any type of work, think about the new book that you just came out. How many different threads and fragments of cloth have been put together in that piece to make that book come alive? We all know what they are. We can go back and just look at our index and find our references. Those are all the different threads that are woven together to create this kind of piece of writing. And it's just a beautiful book. And so along the ways, I'm also considering poems as portals and poems and different sorts of ideas. So I'm looking for prompts. So you notice here too, one is writing faster than you can think, or I don't remember, but I'm trying to keep myself focused on process, where I think about, this is one thing that we can do. So when I was thinking about my students, especially students at home, look around the room. You notice it catches your attention and write it down. We're thinking about that process, and that is just giving us a chance to kind of think about those places and spaces that we find ourselves in, and knowing that it's okay to write about those types of things. So
That they seem so insignificant.
that's right.
So as a teacher, let me get this straight. What you've done is you've used your notebook to reflect on and interpret a poem, but then you're flipping it into um, a provocation and you're trying to determine how you might use the poem
That's
as a
right.
framework and as inspiration, and you're breaking it into an incredibly tangible to-dos for writers as
Yeah,
well.
we're
Is that what you've done here?
invitations to write. That's what
Yeah.
we're doing. That's exactly what's happening. And by invitations, I mean the definition of invitation. So today is a Tuesday, and on Tuesdays in my class we have independent writing. So you might have heard of independent reading, or SSR, where we take 15 minutes or a chunk of time for independent reading. I've also adopted independent writing time, where we take a chunk of time to just write. And it can be whatever you want. A lot of times students, and I really, to be honest, I'd like to have a prompt because I'm not always just ready to think about something. So I will offer something like these, but I'll also always say at the end, I don't care what you write. I just care that you write and that you're doing so creatively.
Right.
So it's not meant to be homework time. It's just meant for you to kind of get your thoughts on paper, and I find that doing this kind of, to borrow Natalie Goldberg's term, it helps to free that writer within. Um, and it actually moves itself into some of the more academic pieces that we do too, where things actually begin to have a voice instead of just an academically minded kind of voice, which can tend to be very dry. It's not
Right.
always that way. But what are the pieces that people tend to gravitate to? Something where you can insert yourself and still honor, well, we're inserting yourself into the conversation
Right.
and still honors the other voices. And so you become not um, not a separate part of a conversation, but a literal inserted part of the conversation. And that's, my gosh, that's kind of fun, you know?
Yeah, and I've never considered how this independent writing experience and the opportunity to have a lot of freedom there sort of sharpens the saw for adding voice to more academic writing. That's beautiful. I love that approach.
And it's just practice,
Yeah.
right? It's ungraded practice. It's very low risk. Once every 6 weeks, I'm going to ask students to look back into their notebooks and see if they can find something that they find is surprising to them, something that they were surprised that they wrote, because it probably has a lot of power and a lot of energy. And I ask them to take that, revise it, reflect upon it, write it into a publishable looking piece. And why every 6 weeks? Two reasons, I suppose. One reason is we are in 12-week trimesters, so it's at a midterm for us, so that makes sense. But also, that's kind of the process Stephen King follows too. He'll write for like 6 weeks, and then he'll put it away, and then he'll work on something else for 6 weeks, and then he'll pull it back out. So now he has fresh eyes. So when the 6 weeks is up, we've been doing a lot of ungraded, low-risk writing. When they go back and look, they're looking at it again from a reader's perspective instead of a writer's perspective. And they have fresh eyes to begin to identify, man, actually, what I wrote, that sounds pretty good. I never really thought about this before, but maybe I am a writer after all.
It also opens up a lot of room for bad writing without having to judge it or evaluate it or tell ourselves that we're not great writers, because the fact is that all of us who write, we write a lot of bad stuff before we find the stuff that's good.
I probably deleted about a book's worth of words just for creating confident writers.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So talk with me a little bit about that book and what you and Troy have offered the world here through that book that's a little bit different than maybe what other people might find elsewhere.
Well, I think in creating confident writers, our main focus was not so much on the skills and drills of writing, but what it means to create an environment where you can feel confident in what you're doing as a writer. We have a 3 kind of pronged premise. The idea of inviting, encouraging, and celebrating students' work. And writing like this is just one of those ways that we can do invitations. I also today working on elements of fiction things, but I'm weaving in lots of choice in there, so that students are invited to choose kind of what they want to focus on, and then we use it as a collaborative piece to build out of it. We spend a lot of time in the book focusing on the success for post-secondary writing. And a lot of that includes things like curiosity, creativity, perseverance, metacognition, engagement, flexibility, all those types of things that writers need to kind of have. And it doesn't matter where you go in a post-secondary environment, right? We're going to be writing in anything that we do. Right? Writing is just a part of our life, and it can look in lots of different ways. There's lots of genres. But if we're able to honor those things, those habits of writing for ourselves, then the writing can come out in very surprising ways. I think the more we try to structure what a piece is supposed to look for somebody, we're no longer allowing the writer to kind of help create their own mold. We are kind of creating the mold for them. And if it doesn't fit well for what you're trying to do, then you feel like maybe you're doing it wrong, which isn't
So how
necessarily
do you ensure quality then? How does that happen?
Well, it starts with the invitation of here's a larger topic, and you propose to me what it is that you want to write about and that you want to think about and what you want to work about. So think about it like this, right? For NCTE, because I know you and I have gone there, and we've both presented there. When you go to conferences like that, there might be an overarching theme, right? So this year's overarching theme was confluencia. I may be pronouncing that wrong, but there was an overarching theme. But do they tell you, Angela, how to write to that theme?
No.
You create a proposal, right? And then it goes through a series of, I guess, people who are looking at it to see how well it fits. I ask under a certain theme that we have. So for example, tragedy is going to be a theme that's going to be coming up in my class here in a few weeks. Under the theme of tragedy, I ask them to think about a proposal about how they might want to study that idea of tragedy. So they create, to me, a proposal, and I'm like the conference committee, right? So I'm not going to tell you whether it's good or bad or indifferent, but I'm going to say, this is what I like, and this is where I think you might need to tweak a little bit, and how are you thinking about this, and getting into the so what questions. But we also, and you know this too, just from using the NCTE idea, you've been to presentations before, you've seen lots of them. I have too. Those are like mentors for us, right? We even talk about people in the field as being mentors. So when I can share work that other students have done, which is not a new thing, but a lot of times we think about mentor texts, we think about those professional texts. The professional text can seem a little bit intimidating, especially in practice.
I find that writers need examples of people who are doing things that are just outside their reach.
That's right.
And there's some research to suggest that that's how people grow best, is not by necessarily chasing after the experts in the field and trying to replicate or stand on their shoulders too much, but by having collaborators and circles that they've joined where they can get diverse perspectives and look at how different people are approaching the work, for sure.
And that's what we do.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, that's what we do with our student work too. I don't just ask them like to look at this piece. I ask them, so what is drawing you in? What is pulling you into this piece? Because as a reader, if you can kind of identify what's pulling you into a piece, then as a writer, you can begin to emulate some of those things that you're finding interesting to get pulled into it, that'll help other people to get pulled into your work as well. Just to put a little cap on that, I suppose.
So then some of the celebration and some of the what of what we share inside of a great writing workshop is not necessarily about the work or even the process alone, but it's about the dispositions that we're developing. And it's about how our mindsets are influencing our work as well, and what we're learning through reflection. And that's just a gorgeous thing.
That's right.
I don't want to keep you too much longer because I know that you have a class to teach.
That's okay. But could I share one more example?
Yeah, please do.
You got me super excited. And this actually, this is an example that's from the book. So it's student work, but it's work that I have permission to share. But I think just to kind of finish up our conversation, it helps to see, we talked about the invitations, you can hear the encouragement, right? So what do you want to do? What are you trying to do with this piece? And then I can help people get there, and we can help each other do that too. But sometimes students work, and you know this, we all know this, it's so brilliant that to leave it in a notebook somewhere or to leave it digitized in a Google Drive somewhere is just a shame. So from a writer's perspective, if I see something, I'll ask people to come over and say, I want you to see this because I want to make sure that I'm seeing what you're seeing. And I'll read their piece to them and I'll say things like, do you see this line? Do you see that stanza? You wrote that? And of course they did. That's amazing. Just amazing. Like little celebrations like that too. And sometimes they turn into larger celebrations. So I have a website where I kind of keep students' work. And I want to just share this because this comes from a student who told me she did not like to read and she did not like to write, and yet she was in an AP Lit honors class, which seems kind of interesting. But we know we have all kinds of students. This is a piece that she wrote titled "Everything But Us," and she's talking about her own personal experience as a young Black woman growing up in a rural mid-Michigan area. They love our head wraps, the way our do-rags, elegant colors and prints, the curve and caress their way around our hair. They love our hair, the ways our kinks and curls and coils frame our elegant faces with such pride. They love our faces, the way the chocolate melts into our eyes and drips down along our arms and stomachs. They love our food, the way the lingering taste of Creole and soul food makes their skin seize with satisfaction. They love our skin. Sun-kissed is never the right word, they say. Infatuated with how the melanin encases our muscles and tendons and smiles. They love the sound of us, where our words and notes curl around the saxophones and double bass. So why is it that these people who claim to love everything about us seem to love everything about us but us? Now I'm going to give her some snaps, and I know she's not around.
And who is this poet?
This is Kennedy Griffin. She's now serving our country through the Marines as well, but just beautiful, beautiful words. Does that happen for every student like that? Maybe not just like that, but
Well, it doesn't happen for any of us all the time like that.
no, but could you imagine something like that just being left inside of a notebook?
That's an incredibly good point, Andy.
And maybe worse, left inside the soul that she didn't even know wanted to come out. So I don't know. We began our conversation, I guess, talking about writing, and we're going to end with writing, but we do that because I think oftentimes that's one of the ways that we can learn how to express ourselves in a way that we want to express ourselves, instead of just perhaps following another writing task because it's in the curriculum and the teacher said you have to do it. Otherwise, you don't get to move on to the next class.
Yeah. Well, thank you for taking this time with me today. I can't wait to share this with other people because it was a meandering conversation, but I learned a lot through it personally. Tell everybody what your book is, because in as much as I'm thrilled to have you talk with me about stuff I wrote about, I really want to, and the purpose of these conversations is to elevate the works of other people too. So tell us a little bit about that and where people can find it.
Creating Confident Writers was wrote between myself and Dr. Troy Hicks. It's published through W.W. Norton, and they're doing a new sort of education line. And this is, I think, the second or third book in the education line. I mean, where to find it? You can find it anywhere. I mean, Amazon, I guess, is a good place, but Barnes & Noble, you can find it. You can go to Norton's website, and you can find it there as well.
Wonderful. In October, I'm going to be focusing a newsletter, centering the newsletter around this interview, and I'll be giving a copy of that book away as well. So you'll be able to
Amazing.
find it
Thank
there
you.
too. Yeah. So I'm going to say goodbye for a minute to everyone who's listening, but hang out for 1 minute and I'll say goodbye to you personally too.